strange, thinking back on that day now. Some people claim they've had experiences they can't explain, moments when they knew something was watching them. Or worse, something wanted them. I never believed in things like that. Not until April 16, 1984. That day started like any other. I was stationed as a ranger in the Bitterroot Wilderness, Montana. It was my job to keep an eye on the trails, guide any lost campers, and ensure the wilderness remained, well, wild. The trees stretched tall and thick, their dark green canopy blotting out the sky. Even on the clearest days, a strange dimness hung over the forest, as though the trees carried old, heavy secrets they wouldn't let sunlight touch. The trail I was patrolling that morning was the kind most hikers avoided, overgrown, barely marked, and easy to lose. It twisted deep into the forest, a place where nature reclaimed everything. I'd walked it a few times before, just to ensure nothing too dangerous was going on. And every time I did, it felt like stepping into an ancient place untouched by people. But that morning, something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling, like a knot sitting at the bottom of my gut. The fog rolled in thick and early, clinging to the forest floor like it wanted to swallow everything in its path. It wasn't unusual for the area. Montana mornings could be foggy, but something about this mist felt different. Heavier. About 3 miles down the trail, I noticed the first sign. A deer carcass, if you could even call it that. It was mutilated, ripped apart in a way that no predator I knew would do. Wolves and bears kill out of hunger or defense, but this was something else. Its skin was slashed deep with strange claw marks, marks that looked too wide and too jagged to come from anything I recognized. There were flies swarming around it, buzzing angrily in the still air, but I couldn't bring myself to move closer. My stomach churned, and an uneasy feeling settled over me. I should have called it in right then and there. But I didn't. I told myself it was probably just some predator fight gone bad. I mean, things happen out in the wild, right? Animals turn on each other. No big deal. I moved on. The fog thickened as the hours passed, and soon it felt like walking through a dream where nothing made sense and every step took you further from reality. I tried to radio back to the station, just to check in, protocol and all that, but all I got was static. At first I blamed the fog. Maybe it was messing with the signal. But then, something else came through. A whisper. Just my name, carried on the wind. Jack. It was faint, almost like a trick of the mind, but clear enough to stop me dead in my tracks. My heart pounded as I scanned the trees, half expecting to see someone peeking out from behind a trunk or waving from the trail ahead. But there was nothing, just silence. I told myself it was the wind. The forest has a way of playing tricks on you when you're alone, I thought. No need to panic, but I quickened my pace. Another mile or so and I came across an abandoned campsite. That's when things started getting worse. The tent was ripped open as if something had clawed its way inside. There were clothes scattered on the ground, torn and stained with blood. I found a boot, just one, sitting a few feet away with a bloody sock still stuffed inside. Whoever had been here, they left in a hurry. Or something made them leave. I bent down to pick up a trail, maybe footprints, drag marks, something, and that's when I noticed them. Massive prints, too large to belong to any human or known animal, leading away from the camp. They pressed deep into the soil like something heavy had trudged through. And the strangest part, they had too many toes. A chill ran down my spine, but I tried not to let my imagination run wild. Bears leave weird prints sometimes, I told myself. I repeated it like a mantra. I'd read stories too, stories the locals told about a creature that roamed the Bitterroot. A spirit. A curse. They called it the Wendigo. I'd always dismissed it as folklore, until now. The sun dipped lower, though it was hard to tell through the fog. That's when I heard it again. My name. Jack. It was clearer this time. Right behind me, as if someone were standing just over my shoulder, breathing the word into my ear. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the mist, but there was no one there. Just the trees stretching into the endless fog and the distant sound of something breathing. I grabbed my radio again, desperate now. Static. I tapped the side of the device, cursed under my breath, and tried once more. Base, this is Ranger Jack? Do you copy? Nothing. Then, softly, so faint I almost missed it. I heard the radio crackle, and in that brief moment, just beneath the static, I heard someone else's voice. Run. The word hit me like a punch to the gut. My breath caught, and I felt that knot of fear twist tighter in my stomach. The forest around me seemed to shift, like it was alive, watching, waiting. I swung my flashlight wildly, searching for any sign of movement. That's when I saw it. Eyes. 2 glowing eyes staring at me from between the trees. They weren't the eyes of any animal I'd ever seen. Too bright, too deliberate. They didn't blink. They just stared. And then, slowly, the figure stepped forward, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of its silhouette. Tall, thin, too thin, like skin stretched over bone. And those claws, long, jagged, and glinting faintly in the beam of my flashlight. I didn't wait. I ran. The forest seemed to come alive around me as I sprinted down the trail, branches clawing at my arms and legs, the heavy thud of footsteps pounding behind me. It moved faster than anything I'd ever heard, each step closing the distance between us. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The only thing I could do was run and pray that whatever was chasing me wouldn't catch up. My lungs burned, and my legs screamed in protest, but I kept going. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until I could hear its breath, a ragged, wet rasp just behind my ear. And then, just as I thought I couldn't run any further, I heard the scream. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something else entirely, a sound so unnatural it made my blood run cold. And then, silence. I don't remember how I made it back to the station. I just remember running until my legs gave out, collapsing on the floor and gasping for air. When the other rangers found me, they said I was babbling nonsense, something about glowing eyes and claw marks in the dark. They never found the campsite I described. No footprints, no blood, and the carcass, gone, as if it had never been there at all. But I know what I saw. To this day, I can still hear that scream in my nightmares. I can still feel those eyes watching me, even when I'm safe at home. The forest doesn't forget, and neither do I. If you thought that was chilling, brace yourself for what's coming next. It was one of those nights that could almost make you forget it was October. The fog sat heavy on the lake, like a thick gray blanket draped over the water. The trees around me stood eerily still, their branches reaching upward, black veins against a pale moon. I wasn't new to this kind of setting. Working as a park ranger meant I had seen my fair share of fog, forest silence, and the occasional strange report from hikers. But that night was different. My name is Anna Matthews. I'd worked at Blue Ridge Parkway for about 5 years by 1996. It's a lonely, beautiful place. Winding mountain roads, endless forests, and lakes so deep and cold they could hide anything. The peace it offers is like a double-edged sword. It can either heal you or haunt you, depending on what kind of thoughts you bring with you. That evening had started out normal enough. I was covering a late shift, mostly just paperwork and radio check-ins. Just before sundown, I got a call from one of the older locals, Mrs. Johnson. She sounded breathless, like she'd been running or maybe panicking. She said she saw the lights again. The ghost lights, she whispered. They're back, same as before. I sighed, rubbing my temples. Mrs. Johnson, we talked about this. There's nothing out there, just swamp gas or boaters. No, she snapped. Not boaters. Ain't no one out there this late, and you know it, girl. Go see for yourself. I didn't have much of a choice. Keeping the peace was part of the job, and if checking out some spooky lights meant calming folks down, so be it. I grabbed my flashlight, slung my radio over my shoulder, and hopped into the truck. The boathouse was on the far side of the lake, about a 20-minute drive from the station. Most of the tourists had cleared out for the season, and by the time I arrived, the sun had dipped low, leaving everything bathed in that strange, blue-gray twilight. The road to the boathouse was overgrown, a dirt path winding down toward the water. I parked the truck and stepped out, the gravel crunching loudly under my boots. It was quiet, too quiet. No crickets, no owls, just the lapping of water against the dock. A fog bank rolled in thick and sudden, and I could barely see 5 feet ahead of me. I clicked on my flashlight, and the beam cut a narrow path through the mist. The boathouse stood hunched over the water, its wooden frame rotting from years of neglect. It looked more like a shadow of a building than an actual structure, something half forgotten and out of place. As I approached, the dock groaned under my weight. That's when I saw the fish. At first, I didn't know what I was looking at. The thing was half rotted, lying belly up near the edge of the dock, its eyes cloudy and sunken. But it wasn't just one fish. There were several, scattered around in random clusters, like someone had tossed them there and left them to rot. I leaned in closer, holding my breath against the smell. Something about the way the fish were arranged didn't feel right. They weren't just dead. They looked mangled, like they'd been clawed at. That's when I noticed the marks. Long, deep scratches ran down the wooden posts of the dock, as if something with sharp nails had tried to climb out of the water. My stomach nodded. The rational part of my brain tried to explain it away. Maybe it was an animal, a bear, or some kind of big cat. But deep down, I knew better. Then I heard it. It started as a faint whisper, barely audible over the gentle ripple of the lake. "Anna?" I froze, every hair on the back of my neck standing on end. The voice was soft, familiar, like someone saying my name from just behind me. I whipped around, but there was no one there. Just the fog pressing in close. "Anna." The whisper came again, this time from the water. I stepped closer to the edge of the dock, shining my flashlight over the surface. That's when the beam flickered. "Damn it," I muttered, slapping the side of the flashlight. The light sputtered, then went out completely, leaving me in darkness. I stood there for a moment, paralyzed, listening to the sound of my own breathing. The fog seemed thicker now, swirling in strange patterns over the water. And beneath it, just below the surface, I saw movement. Something was there. At first I thought it was a fish, but the shape was too large, too fluid. It glided beneath the water like a shadow, long and thin, circling the dock in slow, deliberate movements. I stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest. The boards beneath my feet creaked loudly, and the whisper came again, louder this time. "Anna, come closer." My flashlight flickered back to life for a brief second, casting a weak beam over the water. That's when I saw it, just for a moment. A figure rising slowly from the lake. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its hair floated around its face like a dark halo. I couldn't make out any features, but its eyes, they were wide and hollow, staring right at me. Then it reached out. Its hands were skeletal, with long, bony fingers that dripped with lake water. I stumbled backward, barely catching myself before I fell off the dock. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. The thing didn't speak, but I felt its presence, cold and heavy, like a weight pressing down on my soul. It wanted something, and then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The water rippled where it had been, but the figure vanished beneath the surface without a sound. I stood there, shaking, trying to convince myself that I hadn't seen what I thought I'd seen. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something was in that lake, and it had noticed me. I don't remember how I made it back to the truck. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. My radio crackled to life, and the voice on the other end sounded distant, almost dreamlike. "Anna? Are you there? What's going on?" It was my supervisor, Steve. I tried to answer, but my throat was dry, and no words came out. I could still feel the cold touch of those fingers on my arm, like a lingering stain that wouldn't wash away. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. A week later, I found an old diary tucked away in a forgotten corner of the ranger station. It belonged to a ranger named Mark Hastings, who had worked here years before me. His last few entries were erratic, filled with ramblings about the Weeper, a spirit that lured people into the lake. His final entry sent chills down my spine. "She calls to me. Every night. I can't resist much longer." Mark was never found. It's been almost 30 years since that night, and I still think about it. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can hear the whisper of my name, soft and seductive, calling me back to the water. I never went back to that lake, but I know it's still out there waiting, and so is she, the Weeper. Some nights, I wonder if Mark was right. Maybe she's not just a story, maybe she's real, and maybe one day she'll come for me again. And when she does, will I be able to resist? Just when you thought it couldn't get any darker, this next story will prove you wrong. July 23rd, 2005, Joshua Tree National Park. You know how most days on the job start out normal? Just another shift? Nothing crazy? I guess that's the comfort of routine. I've been a ranger for 5 years now. I've seen plenty. Lost hikers, dehydration cases, the usual drunk tourists causing a ruckus. But nothing could have prepared me for what I found that night. That day started like any other. The sun was blazing, the desert air dry and still. It was midsummer, and if you've ever been to Joshua Tree in July, you'd know it feels like the whole place is asleep. You'd swear the rocks are watching, waiting for something. I was patrolling one of the remote trails, the kind visitors aren't supposed to camp on. This part of the park wasn't well traveled, but every now and then someone would wander off, thinking they could set up a tent for the night. I drove my dusty Jeep down the dirt trail, squinting against the sunlight bouncing off the rocks. The heat waves on the horizon made the landscape ripple. It was quiet, too quiet even for the desert. I reached the top of a small hill and spotted something off in the distance. A campsite, dead in the middle of nowhere. The tent sagged awkwardly like it had been abandoned, and some supplies were scattered nearby. A cooler on its side, a sleeping bag half dragged out of the tent, and a folding chair tipped over in the dirt. Something felt wrong right away. I killed the engine and stepped out, the crunch of gravel under my boots the only sound around. There was no breeze, no birds, no scurrying lizards. Nothing. Just an oppressive, eerie silence that pressed down on me like a weight. I made my way to the tent, calling out, "Park ranger? Anyone here?" No answer. That's when I saw the boulder. It sat just a few feet from the camp, towering over the site like a sentinel, and carved into the surface, deep, jagged letters gouged into the stone, were the words, "It's watching." I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the message. It wasn't just the words, it was the way they looked. Whoever had carved them hadn't been careful. The letters were frantic, uneven, like they'd been scratched out in a panic. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I moved closer to the tent, crouching to inspect the sleeping bag. It had been dragged halfway out, as if someone had been pulled from it. Either that, or they'd left in a hurry. That's when I noticed the skull. At first, I thought it was just some animal remains, common enough out here in the desert. But the closer I looked, the stranger it got. It was bleached white from the sun, like most desert bones, but there were markings carved into it. Not natural cracks, deliberate carvings almost like symbols. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the rough grooves. They weren't anything I recognized. And that's when I remembered the stories. Locals talk about creatures out here, things that aren't quite human, not fully animal either. They call them skinwalkers. Supposedly, they can shift between forms, wearing the skins of the creatures they kill. It's the kind of stuff people say to scare tourists, right? Except, the legends always warned about two things, the silence and the smell. Suddenly I noticed both. The air was heavy, thick with a rancid, rotting odor that seemed to seep into my skin. It hit me so hard I gagged. At the same time, the silence became deafening. My heartbeat drummed in my ears, and every instinct in my body told me to leave. I turned back toward the Jeep, my footsteps crunching louder than they should have in the stillness. I didn't run. I know better than to run in the desert. Running attracts attention, and something about that campsite told me I didn't want any attention. Then I heard it. A low growl. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. The kind of sound that makes your stomach twist and your skin crawl. I shined my flashlight toward the direction of the sound, but the beam flickered. Damn cheap batteries. The growl came again, this time from a different direction. It was lower, more guttural, like whatever made it was changing. Then I saw it. Or at least, I think I did. It stood at the edge of the rocks where the shadows melted into the night. Its shape seemed to ripple, shifting between the outline of a man and some kind of animal. Its limbs were all wrong, too long, too thin, and its eyes, God, those eyes. They caught the last glint of my fading flashlight, reflecting the light like an animal's, but there was something disturbingly human in them. And then my flashlight died. I stood there, frozen, as the darkness swallowed everything. All I could hear was the sound of my own breathing, sharp and shallow, and that thing shifting closer. The smell grew stronger, suffocating. I fumbled with the flashlight, slapping it against my palm, but it was useless. And that's when I knew. I wasn't getting back to the Jeep, not without facing it. The growl came again, inches from my face this time, and I felt hot breath on my skin. Something brushed past my arm, cold and leathery, and I stumbled backward, tripping over the tent. I didn't scream. I couldn't. Then, silence. I don't know how long I lay there, my heart hammering in my chest, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The air was still, the smell was gone, and when I finally found the courage to stand up, the thing, whatever it was gone. I ran back to the Jeep, not daring to look back, and drove like hell out of there. When I reached the station, I tried to explain what had happened, but I couldn't make sense of it myself. They sent a couple of guys to check the site the next morning, but the camp was gone. No tent, no skull, nothing. Just that boulder, standing silent and empty, with no sign of the warning I'd seen carved into it. I've never gone back to that part of the park. I still work here, but I stick to the main trails, where the tourists are. Every now and then, though, I hear things. Stories from hikers. Whispers about strange noises in the desert, sightings of something unnatural. And sometimes late at night when I'm alone in the ranger station, I swear I hear a low growl just outside the window. But when I check, there's nothing there. Nothing at all. The last story was only the beginning. What comes next will make your skin crawl. January 12, 1988, Glacier Bay National Park. It was one of those days when the cold bites so deep that it settles in your bones, making every breath feel like a needle to the lungs. I should have been used to it by now. Winters this far north have a way of reminding you where you stand. I was a park ranger at Glacier Bay, stationed not far from the frozen lakes and vast wilderness that most folks either romanticize or fear. That morning started out just like any other. Coffee burning hot in my thermos, radio static spitting half-clear weather reports, and a to-do list filled with routine patrols. It was a peaceful day in a lonely kind of way. The snowstorm was expected to hit later in the evening, so I figured I had time to finish my rounds and get back before things got nasty. If only I had. There's a strange kind of stillness out in the snow, like the world forgets how to breathe. The crunch beneath your boots becomes the only sound, and it's easy to get the feeling that you're being watched. Most days, it's nothing more than your mind playing tricks on you, but every once in a while, it's not. Growing up in Bartlett Cove, not far from the park, I heard all sorts of stories from the old-timers. Most of them were the usual small-town folklore. Ghost ships, old miners' curses, that sort of thing. But one story stood out. The Frost Walker. They said it only came out during the deepest winter nights, when the wind carried a certain kind of howl. The Frost Walker was no ordinary predator. It didn't leave tracks like a bear or wolf, and it didn't make a sound unless it wanted you to hear it. It would appear just as the snow started to fall, lurking at the edge of the storm, waiting. Nobody knew what it looked like, exactly. Those who claimed to have seen it only ever caught glimpses, something tall and thin, with limbs too long to belong to anything human. A shadow that moved impossibly fast through the blizzard, always just out of sight. They said if you ever heard it crunching the snow behind you, you'd never make it home. Of course, most folks dismissed it as nonsense, just a story to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods. I used to believe that too, but that was before January 12, 1988. It all started with a bloody trail. I was making my way along the edge of one of the smaller lakes when I saw it. Dark red streaks against the snow, leading away from the tree line and out onto the ice. It wasn't the first time I'd come across blood in the park. Animals hunt, things get messy. But this trail was different. It was fresh. Curious and uneasy, I followed it, my hand resting on the grip of my radio, ready to call in if I found something serious. The closer I got to the lake, the worse it looked. Whatever had been dragged across the snow wasn't small. Deep grooves in the snow suggested it had put up a fight. Probably a deer, I figured. But the strange thing was that the trail didn't stop at the edge of the lake. It continued out across the ice. I hesitated for a moment. The storm was rolling in faster than I'd expected, and the last thing I wanted was to fall through the ice or get caught in a whiteout. But something about the trail gnawed at me, an itch at the back of my mind that I couldn't shake. I took a step out onto the lake, then another. The ice groaned beneath my boots, but it held. That's when I saw the claw marks. Long, jagged lines scratched into the surface of the ice, as if something with enormous claws had tried to drag itself, or something else, across it. I crouched down, running my glove along the edges of the grooves. They were deep. Too deep. No animal I knew of could make marks like that. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of snow crunching underfoot. I shot up, heart pounding, and looked around. Nothing. Just swirling snow and the silent stretch of the frozen lake. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe a fox, but something in my gut told me otherwise. I started walking back toward the shore, quickening my pace. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The sound followed me, keeping perfect rhythm with my steps. I stopped, it stopped. My breath came out in shaky clouds as I stood there, listening, waiting. Nothing. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just the echo of my own footsteps on the ice. But then I took another step, and this time, the crunch came a half-second too late. Something was behind me. I spun around, but the snow was so thick, I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I strained my eyes, scanning the blizzard for any sign of movement. And that's when I saw it. A figure. It was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, and it stood perfectly still just at the edge of visibility, where the snow blurred everything into shadows. At first I thought it might be a tree, but then it moved, just a subtle shift, like a ripple through the storm. And then it was gone, swallowed by the snow. My heart hammered in my chest. I knew I had to get off that lake, now. I turned and started running, my boots slipping on the ice. The wind howled, drowning out everything but the pounding of my own pulse in my ears. The snow was falling harder now, thick and fast, blinding me with every step, but I could feel it. Whatever it was right behind me. I didn't dare look back. I just ran, lungs burning, legs screaming, trying to make it to the shore. Then the ice cracked. It was just a small fracture, but the sound echoed like a gunshot in the frozen silence. My foot slipped and I hit the ice hard, the breath knocked out of me. For a moment, everything was a blur of cold and pain, and that's when I saw it again. The figure loomed above me, standing at the edge of the lake, just close enough that I could make out its outline. It was tall and thin, with limbs too long to belong to anything human, and it wasn't walking. It was gliding, as if the snow carried it forward without effort. Its face, or what I thought might be its face, was shrouded in shadow, but I could feel it staring at me, watching, waiting. I tried to scream, but the cold stole the sound from my throat. Then everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying in the snow, my body half buried beneath a drift. The storm had passed, leaving the world eerily silent and still. My head throbbed, and every muscle in my body ached, but somehow I was alive. I looked around, dazed and confused. There were no tracks in the snow, no sign of the figure, no sign of anything. It was as if the entire encounter had been wiped clean by the storm. I made it back to the ranger station, though I don't remember how. I filed my report, but I left out the part about the figure in the snow. Who would believe me anyway? To this day, I don't know what I saw out there on the lake. I've tried to convince myself that it was just the cold messing with my mind, that it was nothing more than a shadow in the storm. But every now and then, when the wind howls just right and the snow falls thick and fast, I swear I can hear it. The crunch of footsteps, always just a step behind. Think you've heard it all? This next tale will make you think again. I've worked as a ranger at Olympic National Park for 6 years now, and I've always loved the quiet. There's something almost sacred about the way the rain filters through the canopy, the moss-draped branches stretching over the trails, and the cool, misty air that settles deep in your bones. I've always thought of the forest as my second home, a place where I felt safe, even when I was out there alone. But something happened on August 14th, 2012, that I've never told anyone. Not in detail, at least. You might think I'm crazy after hearing this, and honestly, I've asked myself if what I experienced was real or if I just imagined the whole thing. But every time I think back to that day, every small detail floods my mind, too vivid to be dismissed as a bad dream. I know what I saw, and I know what happened to me in those woods. It started like any other shift. I was doing my rounds, hiking the South Fork Ho River Trail, an area of the park that doesn't see many tourists. Most people stick to the popular trails, but this one winds deep into the old-growth forest, twisted roots, thick underbrush, and ferns everywhere. It's beautiful, but easy to get lost if you don't know what you're doing. It was mid-August, so it wasn't cold, but the forest was damp from last night's rain. There was no one around, just me, the trees, and the occasional chirp of birds in the distance. I had my radio on me, but reception is spotty out there. You learn to trust your instincts and stay sharp when you're patrolling alone. About 5 miles in, I noticed something odd just off the trail. A tent. It looked old, really old. The green canvas was covered in moss and vines, as if it had been sitting there for years, untouched. But here's the thing. I walk this trail all the time. There was no way I could have missed it before. Curiosity got the best of me. I stepped off the trail and pushed through the underbrush to get a closer look. The tent was sagging, the stakes barely holding it in place. I crouched down and pulled the flap open. Inside were a few rotted blankets, a rusted lantern, and an old backpack that looked like it had been sitting in the damp for decades. Everything smelled of mildew and decay. I pulled the backpack closer and unzipped it. Inside there were some clothes, a notebook, and a Polaroid camera. The notebook was ruined. Water had bled the ink into unreadable smudges. But there was something about that camera. It gave me a weird feeling, like it shouldn't have been there. Polaroids went out of style a long time ago, but the thing looked clean, almost new, like someone had just left it there. That's when I heard the whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind brushing through the trees, but it wasn't. It was low, like a voice just out of earshot, murmuring words I couldn't quite make out. I stood up, scanning the forest around me, but I didn't see anyone. "Hello?" I called out. No answer. And then it hit me. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just a dead, unnatural silence. That's when I started to feel uneasy. I know these woods, and they're never this silent. I stepped back toward the trail, suddenly wanting to put some distance between myself and that tent. That's when the whispering started again. This time, it was clearer. "Leave." I froze. The voice was close, right behind me, like someone standing at my shoulder. I whipped around, expecting to see another hiker or maybe some local playing a prank. But there was no one, just the twisted roots and towering trees, dripping with moss. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the wind. But my gut told me something was wrong. I took a step back toward the trail, and that's when I felt it. The ground shifted beneath my feet, like the earth was moving. I stumbled, grabbing onto a nearby branch for balance. As I looked down, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A root, thick and covered in moss, was curling out of the ground. At first, I thought it was just a natural movement, like how some roots shift over time. But then I saw it: bones. The root was tangled around skeletal remains, human bones, a rib cage, a skull, and long, thin limbs, all encased in the twisting roots. I stared, horrified, as the ground around me seemed to pulse, as if the forest itself was breathing. I scrambled backward, heart pounding. I knew I had to get out of there. But as I turned to run, I saw it, standing just a few feet away from me. It looked like a man, but not quite. His skin was covered in moss, clinging to him like a second skin. His eyes were empty sockets, black and hollow, but somehow aware. The figure swayed slightly, as if the forest breeze was pushing it, but I knew it was watching me. The whispering grew louder, now a chorus of voices, all saying the same thing. "Stay with us." My legs refused to move. I was frozen in place, staring at the thing in front of me. The figure took a slow step forward, its foot sinking into the soft earth without a sound. And that's when I realized the forest wasn't just alive. It was hungry. I don't know how I managed to move, but somehow I did. I turned and bolted down the trail, branches slapping against my face, roots trying to trip me at every step. The whispering followed me, growing louder and more desperate, as if the forest itself didn't want me to leave. When I finally made it back to the main trailhead, I collapsed, gasping for air. My radio was dead. No signal. I tried calling for help, but the words caught in my throat. How could I explain what had just happened? I looked back toward the forest, half expecting to see the moss-covered figure standing at the edge, watching me. But there was nothing. Just the quiet, misty woods, as if nothing had ever happened. I reported the abandoned tent to my supervisor the next day, but when a search team went out to look, they found nothing. No tent, no bones, just an empty patch of forest. I never went back to that part of the park again. I don't know what I saw that day. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe the stories about the Moss Man are real, and the forest really does claim people who wander too far. All I know is that something out there didn't want me to leave, and every time I close my eyes, I still hear the whispering. "Stay with us." That was only a taste of the horror. This next story will leave you breathless. March 10th, 1994, Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I've been a park ranger for nearly 15 years. In that time, I've seen just about everything. People getting lost, black bears rummaging through campsites, and even the occasional ghost story passed around by campers who've had too much to drink. But this one I've kept to myself for years. Until now. And if you think I'm making this up, well, I wish I was. It started on a Friday, right after a heavy rain. The air smelled like damp leaves, and the mist clung to the mountains like a thick blanket. Mornings like that usually meant fewer hikers, which was a relief. The park draws in tourists year-round, and while it's beautiful, the Smokies can be treacherous if you don't know the terrain. A sudden fog can throw off even the most experienced hiker, and the trails can disappear under your feet. That day, I was on a routine patrol along one of the lesser-traveled trails, Cold Creek Loop, a 7-mile stretch winding through dense forest and up into the higher elevations. My job was to check the trail markers and clear away any fallen branches, just routine maintenance stuff. I had a thermos of coffee and my old beat-up radio hooked to my belt. It was just me, the forest, and the mist. Peaceful, at least at first. About 2 miles in, I noticed the first claw marks. They were deep, gouges cut into the bark of a tall pine tree, about 6 or 7 feet off the ground. Bears sometimes do that, but these were strange. They weren't spaced like bear claws, and they ran almost perfectly parallel. What stuck with me most, though, was the depth. Whatever made those marks was strong, much stronger than any animal I'd ever seen. I snapped a quick picture with the disposable camera I carried, just in case, but told myself not to overthink it. Maybe it was a bear with a weird swipe pattern. I kept walking, trying not to let my imagination run away from me. But the deeper I went into the forest, the thicker the mist got. By the time I hit the 3rd mile marker, I could barely see a few feet in front of me. The cold was starting to set in too. One of those deep, bone-chilling colds that makes you feel like you'll never get warm again. That's when I first heard it. It was a low, humming noise, like the vibration of an old fridge, but it came from everywhere at once. It wasn't loud, just enough to make the hairs on my arms stand up. I stopped in my tracks, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but the fog swallowed everything. I even turned off my radio, thinking maybe it was interference from another station, but the hum stayed. Constant, subtle. I told myself it was just the wind, that I was overreacting. But a few minutes later, I stumbled upon a jacket. It was draped over a branch, stained with something dark, blood. The fabric was damp, and when I lifted it, the weight of the moisture sent chills down my spine. Nearby, I found a small pile of animal bones, clean, white, and picked dry. This wasn't some animal's meal. The bones were arranged in a neat little circle, like someone or something had left them there on purpose. At this point, every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave. But I'm a ranger. People depend on us to stay calm and think rationally, even when things feel off. I clipped the jacket to my backpack and kept moving, my footsteps crunching softly over wet leaves. But now, I was listening. Every shift of the trees, every whisper of the wind felt like a warning. And then I saw it. Through the mist, just barely visible, was a shape. A tall, hulking figure, standing perfectly still about 50 yards away. It wasn't moving, just watching. I squinted, trying to make out details, but the fog made it impossible. It looked like a man, but there was something wrong about it. Its limbs were too long, its posture too unnatural. Then it stepped forward. The shadow moved slowly, like it had all the time in the world. A low growl rumbled through the air, so deep I could feel it in my chest. My heart started pounding, but my legs refused to move. All I could do was stand there, frozen, as the thing crept closer. That's when my radio crackled to life. "Tom, come in, Tom." The voice on the other end was garbled, distorted, but it said my name clear as day. I grabbed the radio from my belt and pressed the talk button. "This is Ranger Tom. Who is this?" Static. Then, "Tom, help me." It sounded like a woman's voice, but I couldn't be sure. The signal was cutting in and out, and there was this strange echo, like the voice was bouncing off the mist itself. I was about to call for backup when the voice said something that sent a cold wave of fear through me. "It's watching you." The radio went dead. That was enough for me. I turned on my heel and started running, something I never do in the field. But it didn't matter how fast I ran. The mist was everywhere, pressing in from all sides, and the humming grew louder the deeper I went. I don't know how long I ran. Time felt slippery out there, like minutes stretched into hours. All I knew was that the thing was following me. I could hear its footsteps. Slow, deliberate, always just out of sight. I thought I was making progress when I hit a familiar bend in the trail. Relief washed over me for a second, but then I saw it. The same blood-stained jacket hanging from the same branch. I had been running in circles. Panic hit me hard. My breath came in ragged gasps and my legs felt like jelly. I knew I had to keep moving, but it felt like the forest was working against me, twisting the trails, leading me deeper into the mist. Then I heard it. Right behind me. A low, rumbling growl, closer than ever. I turned, and for the briefest moment I saw it. A towering, shadowy figure with glowing eyes, standing just a few feet away. The radio crackled again, but this time it wasn't a voice. It was laughter. I bolted, not caring where I was going anymore. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing into the wet underbrush. The mist wrapped around me like a shroud, and I could feel the thing closing in. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the sound of my own name, whispered from the fog. I woke up hours later, lying on the side of a different trail. No sign of the shadow, no mist, just the bright, cold light of morning. My radio was busted and the jacket was gone. I hobbled back to the station, shaken but alive. I filed a report, said I got turned around in the fog and lost my way. But I never mentioned the figure, or the bones, or the voice on the radio. Some things aren't meant to be explained. I still think about that day sometimes, especially when the mist rolls in. And every time I step onto a trail, I can't shake the feeling that something out there is watching, waiting. And next time, it might not let me go. You may want to turn on a light for this next one, if you dare. November 25th, 2000, Mount Rainier National Park. It's strange how clear that day remains in my memory. I remember everything. The snow crunching under my boots, the biting cold, and the eerie silence of the forest. I never used to be afraid of the woods. Working as a ranger for 7 years, I'd seen my share of odd things. Campers getting lost, animals behaving strangely, and the occasional weather anomaly. But nothing prepared me for that night. It started like any other shift. I was assigned the south boundary near the old fire lookout. It was late November, and Mount Rainier was already buried under a fresh blanket of snow. The air smelled crisp, and every step I took sent a soft puff of white into the air. My radio crackled to life around 3 p.m. Dispatch told me they'd received a missing persons report. 2 campers were supposed to return that morning, but hadn't. No big deal, I thought. People get delayed all the time. But something about the call gave me pause. Locals had been talking about a strange phenomenon this winter, whispers of the snowstalker. I dismissed it as campfire gossip, a spooky story to scare hikers. It was supposed to be the spirit of a man who got lost out here years ago. According to legend, he wandered through the snowstorm, calling out for help, but no one ever found him. Now, they say, he lures people deeper into the woods with fake cries for help. I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, but that didn't stop me from feeling uneasy as I checked my gear and strapped on my radio. Something about the way the locals spoke of the snowstalker stuck with me, like they believed it more than they let on. The snow started falling again as I made my way toward the campsite, the flakes soft and relentless, making visibility difficult. The trees felt taller in the heavy snowfall, their dark trunks like silent sentinels watching my every step. It took me about 40 minutes to reach the area where the missing campers were last seen. The place was eerily quiet. No wind, no distant sounds of wildlife, just the crunch of my own boots and the occasional radio static. When I finally found the campsite, my stomach dropped. The tent was half collapsed, sagging under a thin layer of snow. Belongings were scattered everywhere, backpacks, food wrappers, even a pair of gloves. There was no sign of the campers, though. I called out their names, Megan, Charlie, but only silence answered me. That's when I saw the handprints. There were several of them, pressed deep into the snow. At first I thought they were just tracks. Maybe the campers had gotten into trouble and crawled through the snow. But as I looked closer, I realized something was wrong. The prints were smeared, as if the hands had been dragged. And some of them, most of them, were bloody. The back of my neck prickled. I scanned the area with my flashlight, the beam sweeping over the twisted trees. That's when I heard it, a faint sound, carried on the wind like a whisper. "Help, please." It was distant, barely audible. My breath hitched, and I instinctively tightened my grip on the flashlight. I called out, "Hello, Megan? Charlie?" But there was no response, only that weak, pitiful cry drifting through the trees. I should have called for backup right then, but something compelled me to move toward the sound, deeper into the forest. The snow thickened as I walked, and the temperature seemed to drop by the minute. My boots crunched loudly against the frozen ground, and every now and then I thought I heard footsteps following mine, just a second too late. I'd stop and listen, but there was only silence. "Help? Over here." The voice was closer now. I could see a shape ahead, just a vague silhouette in the distance, pale against the dark forest. It looked like a person, waving their arms slowly. Relief surged through me. One of the campers. I called out to them, "I'm coming, stay where you are." The figure didn't respond, just kept waving, as if urging me forward. I picked up my pace, my boots slipping on the icy ground. But the closer I got, the more I realized something was off. The figure wasn't moving toward me. It was standing perfectly still. When I was about 20 feet away, I stopped in my tracks. The figure, if it was even a person, was wearing a thick coat, hood pulled over their head. Snow clung to them, and their entire body was unnaturally pale, almost blending into the landscape. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice sharp in the quiet. But they didn't react. Slowly, cautiously, I took another step forward. My flashlight flickered once, twice, then died. The darkness was sudden and absolute. I fumbled for my spare batteries, but my hands were shaking, clumsy with cold and fear. That's when I heard it, the footsteps. They were close, too close. Slow, deliberate crunches circling me just beyond the edge of my vision. I held my breath, heart hammering in my chest. Then out of the darkness came the faintest whisper. "Why did you come here?" I could barely think. I forced myself to turn the flashlight back on. The pale figure was gone. In its place, resting on the snow, were two empty boots, frozen solid, as if they'd been left there for days. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The forest around me felt alive, watching, waiting. I tried to radio for help, but all I got was static. The footsteps started again, this time coming closer. I knew I had to run, but my legs felt heavy, like I was wading through molasses. The snow seemed to grip me, pulling me down with every step. "Please," I whispered, not even sure who I was talking to. "Please let me go." The footsteps stopped, just behind me. I didn't dare turn around. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting, listening. The air felt thick, charged with something I couldn't explain. And then, a hand touched my shoulder. I don't remember much after that. Somehow I made it back to the station, stumbling through the snow like a drunk. My colleagues found me at dawn, frostbitten and half-conscious. I tried to tell them what happened, but the words wouldn't come out right. They searched the area where I'd been, but they didn't find any boots, no sign of the missing campers. Just a collapsed tent and some scattered gear. Officially, the case was marked as unsolved. But I know what I saw, or what saw me. To this day, I avoid Mount Rainier in winter, and every time the snow falls, I hear it again, that faint, pitiful voice calling from the forest. "Help, please. It's waiting out there, somewhere in the cold. And one day it might call to you too. Just when you think it's safe to relax, the real nightmare begins." I want to tell you about something that happened to me back in the summer of 2018. I worked as a ranger at Yellowstone National Park. It was the kind of job you dream about when you love the outdoors. Clean air, endless trails, and the chance to help people enjoy nature. But, if I'm honest, I was running away from my own demons. My name is Sam Parker. After losing my brother in a car accident the year before, I thought working at Yellowstone would clear my head. I couldn't shake the guilt. It had been my fault. I was behind the wheel. I figured the wilderness would give me the silence I needed to get right with myself again. Instead, it gave me something else. Something I still can't explain. It was June 30th, 2018. A warm night, but the kind that clung with a bit of chill as the sun dropped behind the peaks. Yellowstone's landscape is beautiful but eerie, especially at twilight. Everything feels alive. Steam vents hissing like breath from the earth, boiling mud pots bubbling like something's trying to crawl out. The night shift was usually boring. That's what I liked about it. Most campers stayed in their tents, and the park became a hushed, sprawling wilderness. But that night, the radio buzzed with talk of something weird happening near the remote geyser basin, way off the usual trails. Several campers reported strange sounds, footsteps with no one around, faint knocking like someone was tapping on their tent walls, and some claimed to have seen shapes flickering through the rising steam. We got prank calls from tourists all the time, but there was something about the callers' voices that bothered me. They weren't joking, they sounded scared. Dispatch asked if I could swing by and check it out, and I agreed. I was supposed to close up soon, but the geyser basin wasn't too far. Honestly, I just wanted to clear my mind. The trail to the basin was eerily quiet. I walked alone, my flashlight flickering as the battery fought to stay alive. The sulfur stench of the geysers hung heavy in the air, seeping into my clothes. The ground was warm under my boots, a reminder that molten rock boiled just beneath the surface. I heard a distant thudding sound, like someone dropping a heavy sack onto the ground. I stopped, shining my light in every direction. The trail was empty, but the sound, it wasn't far, wasn't an animal either. I radioed in to let dispatch know I was checking the area, but as I spoke, the radio crackled with static, cutting off my words. I tried again. That's when I heard it, my own voice. "Help me! I'm stuck! Help me!" It was coming from the radio, but I hadn't said those words. It was me, though, my voice. Same tone, same panic. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. What the hell was happening? I scanned the area, but the steam made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Something shifted in the mist, just a flicker of movement. I swung my flashlight toward it, but nothing was there. Then I saw the bones. At first I thought it was just some animal remains, but they weren't scattered like a predator had gotten to them. They were arranged, neatly stacked, blackened as if burned, and covered in a fine layer of ash. Next to them was a stone. It didn't belong there, about the size of my fist, glowing faintly with an odd orange hue. I crouched to touch it, and the moment my fingers brushed the surface, the air felt hotter. A wave of heat rolled over me, making my skin prickle with sweat. Then the ground shifted. A low rumble spread beneath my feet, and the earth trembled. I stumbled backward as a loud hiss exploded from one of the nearby vents, steam shooting into the air. And then I saw it. A figure, impossibly tall with glowing skin like molten rock, rose from the vent, trailing fire in its wake. The heat was unbearable, forcing me to shield my face. Its eyes burned like embers, and it moved toward me, slow and deliberate, as if it had all the time in the world. The ground cracked beneath my boots, crumbling away in chunks. I tried to back away, but the earth was giving out under me. I could feel the heat rising through the cracks, searing my legs through my pants. I reached for the radio, fingers fumbling, and called for help. Anything, but the only response was my own voice again. "Help me. I'm stuck. Help me." That's when the ground opened completely. I fell, dirt and rock cascading around me. I clawed at the edges, desperate to find something solid to grab onto. My fingers scraped against the glowing stone, now resting in the dirt beside me. I grabbed it without thinking. It was burning hot, but I didn't care. I was slipping deeper into the earth, and the only thing that mattered was getting out. Above me, the fiery figure leaned over the edge, watching me. It didn't move to help, didn't move to stop me. It just watched. With one last desperate lunge, I threw myself toward the edge of the pit and grabbed hold of a root sticking out from the ground. My other hand still clutched the stone, its heat searing into my palm. I hauled myself up, inch by inch, until I was back on solid ground. The figure was gone, as if it had never been there, but the air was still scorching, and the earth beneath me throbbed with heat. I radioed in again. This time, someone answered. It was dispatch, asking where I had been. I told them everything, but they didn't believe me. They said no one else had reported anything unusual. When I got back to the station, I checked my palm. The stone was gone, but the burn mark remained. A perfect circle, glowing faintly like embers under my skin. I left Yellowstone a week later. Couldn't stay after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure, those burning eyes, and heard my own voice calling for help. To this day, I don't know what I saw or how it happened. But sometimes, Late at night, I still feel the heat on my skin and smell sulfur in the air. And every now and then, I hear my own voice, faint and distant, whispering from the radio. Help me. If you weren't scared before, this next story will change that. They tell you that you can't prepare for everything, and they're right. I thought I knew that swamp like the back of my hand. Everglades National Park, endless miles of marshland and thick, suffocating vegetation. I'd been a park ranger for 7 years. 7. I knew the calls of every bird, the paths of every gator. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened on the night of September 14, 1975. That night changed everything. I'd volunteered for the evening shift. It was supposed to be easy. Drive around, check the trails, make sure no campers were out where they shouldn't be. The usual stuff. I figured I'd finish by midnight, go home, crack open a beer, and sleep until noon. It was a humid, miserable night. The kind that makes your clothes stick to your skin and every breath feel heavy. I was about 30 minutes into my patrol, driving the park truck along a narrow gravel path, when I noticed something odd. Claw marks. They were deep and jagged, running down the trunk of a cypress tree just off the trail. I stopped the truck, grabbed my flashlight, and walked over to take a closer look. They weren't the kind of scratches you'd expect from a raccoon or a bobcat. These were longer, wider, as if something with big claws had deliberately raked the tree. I stared at the marks for a moment, a strange feeling curling at the edges of my mind. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a bear wandered through. But something about the marks stuck with me, something that felt wrong. I'd never seen anything like them before. And then I heard the first splash. It came from the water, maybe 20 feet away. Just a quick, heavy splash, like something large sliding off the bank and into the swamp. I swept my flashlight across the water, but all I saw were ripples spreading outward, vanishing into the darkness. The surface stilled, but the air felt different, thicker, heavier, like the swamp was holding its breath. I should have gotten back in the truck right then. I should have driven away, but I told myself it was just an animal. Maybe a gator or a big fish. I convinced myself there was nothing to worry about. I wish I hadn't done that. About 10 minutes later, I found the canoe. It was lodged halfway up the bank, tipped at an odd angle, its wood cracked and splintered. I climbed down to take a look, and that's when I saw the clothes. Torn fabric, muddy and damp, was tangled in the branches by the canoe. It looked like someone had been in a hurry to get away, ripping their shirt as they scrambled through the underbrush. There was no sign of the person. No backpack, no flashlight, nothing. Just the clothes, shredded and soaked with mud. And the smell. God, the smell was awful. It was like rotten eggs and dead fish with something else mixed in, something I couldn't quite place. It was thick, oily, and it stuck to the back of my throat. I gagged and had to cover my mouth with my sleeve. That's when I heard it. A low, warbling cry, almost like an animal, but not quite. It sounded distant, echoing through the trees, and it sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't any bird or animal I recognized. Then it came again, closer this time. I felt my skin prickle with unease. The sound wasn't just strange. It was wrong. There's no other way to describe it. It was like hearing someone whistle a tune that shouldn't exist, like the melody was out of sync with the world around it. I reached for my radio, but all I got was static. I twisted the knob, trying different channels, but the only response was the hiss of dead air. My gut tightened. The radio had never given me trouble before, not out here, not in this part of the park. That's when the splashing started again. It wasn't just one splash this time. It was a series of them. Quick, deliberate movements like something wading through the water. And it was getting closer. I swept my flashlight toward the sound. That's when I saw it. Just a glimpse at first. A figure, rising out of the water. It looked wrong. It was human, or at least it had been, but now it was something else entirely. Its skin clung to its bones like wet paper, sagging in places and stretched tight in others. Tangled, matted hair dripped from its head like seaweed, and empty eye sockets stared back at me. For a moment I thought it was a corpse, just some poor soul who drowned in the swamp. But then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, it waded toward me, the water sloshing around its legs. Its hand, if you could call it that, reached out, long fingers dripping with muck. I froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. My body felt like it was made of stone, and all I could do was watch as that thing came closer. The air around me felt thick and heavy, like the swamp itself was pressing down on me, holding me in place. Then I felt it. Cold, wet fingers wrapping around my ankle. I jerked back, but the grip tightened, pulling me toward the water. I thrashed, kicking and clawing at the mud, but it was no use. The thing was stronger than it looked, much stronger. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My radio slipped from my belt and vanished into the muck with a sickening plop. The figure kept pulling, dragging me closer to the water's edge. I could feel the mud sucking at my boots, the cold water creeping up my legs. My flashlight flickered, then died, plunging the world into darkness. I clawed at the ground, desperate for something, anything, to hold on to. My fingers scraped against roots and rocks, but nothing would hold. The smell, the stench was overwhelming now, choking me, making my eyes water. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The hand around my ankle let go, and I collapsed onto the bank, gasping for air. For a moment, everything was silent. No splashes, no strange cries, just the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. I lay there for what felt like hours, too scared to move, too afraid to even breathe. When I finally mustered the courage to sit up, the figure was gone. The water was still, the surface smooth and unbroken, as if nothing had ever disturbed it. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest, and ran like hell, back to the truck. I never found out what that thing was. I reported the abandoned canoe, the torn clothes, the strange claw marks on the tree. They sent a search team out the next day, but they didn't find anything. No footprints, no bodies, nothing. The locals have their theories. They talk about the swamp witch, a spirit who haunts the marshes, cursing anyone who trespasses in her territory. Some say she was a woman who drowned out here years ago, and now she drags others down with her. I don't know if I believe any of that. All I know is what I saw, and what I felt. Some nights when the air is heavy and the wind is still, I swear I can hear that strange cry again, echoing through the trees. And every time I do, I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if that hand hadn't let go? The swamp doesn't give up its secrets easily, and some things are better left alone. Think you can handle one more? This story is the stuff of nightmares. My name is Eva, and I've worked as a park ranger for almost 10 years. There's something about Acadia National Park that feels like home to me. The scent of the sea, the whispering pines, the steady crash of waves against the rocks. If you've spent enough time near the coast, you start to feel a kind of rhythm to it, as if the ocean breathes along with you. It calms me, or at least it used to. The story I'm about to tell feels like a dream now, disconnected, surreal. But it happened. I know it happened. Even as I sit here and try to piece it all together, there are things I can't explain, things I've tried so hard to forget. It started on an unremarkable evening, May 4th, 1999 to be exact. The fog rolled in thick that day, draping everything in a dense, gray curtain. We get fog often here, especially in the spring, but this was something else. It was heavier, colder, like a wet blanket thrown over the world. Visibility was practically zero. No surprise, locals called it drowned fog, thick enough to suffocate a person. My shift was supposed to end at sundown, but around 6:30, a call came in from the park office. A visitor had reported seeing strange lights out near Otter Cliff, a dangerous spot known for its jagged rocks and sudden drops into the Atlantic. Ghost lights, she'd called them. The woman's voice on the other end of the phone had wavered, as if she wasn't sure whether to laugh or be afraid. Normally, I'd chalk it up to tourists seeing something ordinary and imagining it into something else. But Otter Cliff was notorious. There were stories, passed around over campfires and by old-timers in town, about people being lured off the edge by lights that appeared in the fog. The lost sailor, they called it. The tale went like this. A sailor who drowned at sea still wanders the cliffs, holding a lantern to guide ships to safety. But it's not safety he leads them to. It's the rocks. If you see his light and follow it, you never come back. I didn't believe any of that, of course. I've never been one for ghost stories. But the cliffs were dangerous even without any supernatural help. People wandered too close to the edge, got disoriented by the fog, or slipped on wet rocks. And if someone was out there chasing lights, It was my job to make sure they didn't get themselves killed. So I grabbed my flashlight, radio, and jacket and headed out. The walk to Otter Cliff was quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel small. The thick fog muffled everything. The crunch of my boots on gravel, the distant roar of the waves, even the occasional cry of a seagull. It was like the world had been folded into itself. I kept telling myself that it was just a routine patrol. I'd get there, find nothing, and radio back to the office. But as I made my way along the trail, the unease started to creep in. It was subtle at first, a shift in the air, like the atmosphere had thickened. And then I noticed the smell. Not the usual salty tang of the ocean, but something metallic and sour, like rust. It clung to the inside of my nose, making me wince. I picked up the pace, eager to get this over with. The trail wound along the cliffs, and the fog was so dense that I could only see a few feet in front of me. I flicked on my flashlight, but the beam was weak, swallowed by the mist. I tried not to think about the stories, about lights moving through the fog, drawing people closer and closer to the edge. I was almost at the cliffs when I saw it. At first, I thought it was trash, just a crumpled object lying on the trail. But as I got closer, I realized it was an old leather-bound journal, half buried in wet leaves. I picked it up, the leather cold and stiff beneath my fingers. It looked weathered, the pages wrinkled from water damage, but the writing inside was still legible. I flipped through the pages, and what I found made my stomach twist. The journal was filled with frantic notes, warnings scribbled in shaky handwriting. Most of it didn't make sense, but a few phrases stood out. Don't follow the lights. The singing, it calls to you. The edge isn't what it seems. There were pages upon pages of this, repeating over and over, as if the writer had been desperate to get the message across. And then, on the very last page, written in large, slashing letters, if you see the light, run. I stood there holding the journal, my breath clouding in the cold air. I told myself it was probably just some local messing with tourists, but something about it didn't feel like a joke. It felt personal, desperate. A sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, and for just a moment, the fog thinned. And that's when I saw it. They were faint, flickering in and out of the mist like will-o'-the-wisps. Tiny specks of yellow, moving slowly along the edge of the cliff, as if someone were holding a lantern and walking just out of reach. I felt my heart rate spike. It could be someone lost in the fog, a hiker maybe, or another ranger. But as I squinted through the mist, I realized something strange. The lights weren't steady. They bobbed and swayed like they were floating on water, moving closer, then retreating, almost playfully. My radio crackled to life on my hip. "Eva, you copy?" I reached for it, but before I could respond, the signal cut out with a burst of static. And that's when I heard it, the singing. It was faint, barely audible over the wind and the waves, but it was there. A soft, lilting melody drifting through the fog. It sounded human, almost comforting. Without thinking, I took a step toward the lights. The closer I got, the clearer the singing became. It was beautiful, haunting. It pulled at something deep inside me, a longing I didn't know I had. I told myself I just needed to get close enough to see who it was. Maybe they were hurt. Maybe they needed help. But with every step I took, the air grew colder. My flashlight flickered, the beam stuttering like a dying heartbeat. The ground beneath my feet felt slick, unsteady. And still the lights danced just out of reach, always a few steps ahead, as if leading me somewhere. And then I saw it, the edge of the cliff, barely visible through the fog. The lights hovered just beyond it, swaying gently, inviting me closer. My heart pounded in my chest. Something was wrong. Every instinct I had screamed at me to stop, to turn around. But the singing? God, the singing. It was in my head now, wrapping around my thoughts, making everything else feel distant and unimportant. I took another step. My foot slipped on the wet rocks, and for a terrifying second, I thought I was going to fall. I stumbled, catching myself at the last moment, my toes dangling over the edge. The lights swirled in front of me, so close I could almost reach out and touch them. And then, just like that, they vanished. The singing stopped. I stood there, gasping for breath, staring into the empty fog. The silence was deafening. I don't remember how I made it back to the trail. I don't remember much of anything after that. Just fragments, like pieces of a dream. The feel of wet rocks under my hands, the sound of my own breathing, harsh and ragged. I never found out what those lights were. No one else reported seeing them. And when I went back the next day, the journal was gone. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that song, soft and distant, carried on the wind. And every time I do, I wonder how close I came to following it. All the way to the bottom. You know that feeling of isolation? That sudden realization that you're alone somewhere and no one knows exactly where you are? That was me, Kyle, 3 years ago, deep in a cave system on the far edge of Yellowstone National Park. I'd been caving, or spelunking if you want to sound technical, for a few years by then. I'd mapped several small cave networks already, enough to consider myself pretty good at it. That night, I was eager to explore a new area that had recently been discovered, a section people called the Twisted Caves. It was supposed to be intricate and winding, with narrow passages that would challenge even a seasoned spelunker. So, I loaded up my gear and headed out just before sunset, expecting to be back at my truck by midnight at the latest. The cave entrance looked ordinary enough, a dark hole framed by rocks and vines, nothing out of the ordinary. As I stepped inside, a chill ran down my spine. It wasn't the first time I'd felt uneasy entering a cave, but this felt different somehow. I brushed it off, attributing it to the sheer excitement of a new place. Inside, it was like any other cave I'd been in, damp, cold, and silent. I took out my flashlight and started my descent, mapping the tunnel as I went. The light from my flashlight bounced off the stone walls, casting odd, twisted shadows that seemed to move whenever I shifted the beam. The air grew colder the further I went, biting into my skin through my jacket. The first weird thing I noticed was a set of scratch marks on the walls. Long, jagged lines cut into the stone. They looked old, like they'd been there for years, worn down but still visible. At first, I thought they might have been from some large animal, maybe a bear or a mountain lion that had taken shelter in the cave at some point. I'd seen claw marks before, but these were different, longer, deeper. As I continued, the passages twisted and turned, narrow in some places, and opening up into small chambers in others. I was about an hour in when I heard it, a low, guttural breath, somewhere off in the darkness. It was faint, like someone exhaling slowly, deeply. I stopped dead, my flashlight still. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe even a strange echo from my own breathing, but the sound continued. A slow, shuddering exhale. I moved the flashlight around, the beam dancing off the walls, but saw nothing unusual. The cave was empty. The silence felt thicker, though, like it was pressing down on me. I forced myself to keep moving, ignoring the nagging feeling in my gut telling me to turn back. Then, just as I entered a narrow passageway, I saw something that made me freeze. Another set of claw marks, fresher this time, gouged deep into the wall. They were longer than my hand, uneven, as though something had dragged its claws deliberately down the stone. I ran my hand over them, feeling the rough edges. These weren't from any animal I knew. Not a bear, not a mountain lion, nothing that should have been in there. A soft, scuffling noise echoed from behind me. I whipped around, shining the flashlight back down the tunnel. Nothing. Just the empty blackness stretching out behind me. I laughed at myself, a nervous, shaky laugh, and tried to shake it off, but my hands trembled as I gripped the flashlight. I should have turned back then. Any sane person would have. But something kept me going, a mixture of curiosity and stubbornness. I pressed on, ignoring the growing cold, the strange quiet that seemed to follow me. Eventually, I reached a large chamber, the ceiling towering above me. I could barely see the top of it with my flashlight. The walls were jagged, filled with cracks and crevices, and there, in the faint light, I saw it. Eyes. 2 sickly yellow eyes staring back at me from one of the cracks. They were wide, unblinking, with a gleam that made my stomach twist. I froze, my heart pounding so loud I was sure it would give me away. The eyes didn't move. They just stared, empty and soulless. I couldn't see its full shape, but I could make out long, spindly limbs protruding from the darkness. Its fingers, no, its claws, scraped against the stone, long and sharp, making a faint scratching sound that echoed around the chamber. It was like it was sizing me up, deciding if I was worth its time. My legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot. I wanted to run, but something in those eyes held me, paralyzed. I couldn't look away. The creature slowly began to move, its limbs unfolding from the crevice with an unnatural, almost jerky motion. It was silent, too silent, even as it slithered out of the shadows, inching toward me with claws extended. Some primal instinct kicked in, and I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam jittering across the walls. I remembered seeing a narrow passage just behind me, one too small for anything of its size to follow. Without thinking, I lunged for it, squeezing myself through the tight opening. I could feel my backpack scraping against the walls, my heart pounding as I wriggled through, desperate to put distance between me and that thing. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. All I could hear was the scraping of claws on stone, the sound growing fainter as I pushed myself deeper into the passage. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I couldn't hear it anymore. But the feeling of those yellow eyes, that cold, empty stare, stayed with me as I clawed my way back to the surface. When I finally emerged from the cave, I collapsed, gasping for air, my body bruised and scraped from the narrow escape. I don't know how long I sat there, just staring at the cave entrance, half expecting to see those eyes emerge from the darkness. I never went back to the twisted caves after that. No one believed my story, of course. They said it was a mountain lion, a trick of the light, maybe just nerves from being alone in the dark. But I know what I saw, and I know what I felt. The rangers say people still hear things down there, odd sounds, low breaths echoing from the depths. Some say they've even seen faint claw marks on the walls, new ones, as though whatever's down there is still waiting, still watching. But me? I'm never setting foot in those caves again. Whatever that thing was, it's better left in the dark. You made it this far, but the true terror is just beginning. I should begin by saying that I'm not a believer in the paranormal. I've never been superstitious, never believed in ghosts, and certainly never thought that something out of a nightmare would follow me back to my ordinary life. But I don't know how else to explain what happened to me last fall in Black Pines. My name is Emily, and I'll do my best to tell you exactly what I saw that night. It started as a simple photography trip. I'm an amateur photographer? Well, aspiring photographer is probably more accurate. I've always loved capturing scenes in nature, moments that are raw and untouched. Black Pines had been calling me for months. I'd seen photos from other hikers and read about its unique fog, a mist that clings to the trees like some supernatural shroud. People say the fog there is different, almost alive. They call it the veil. Of course, I thought it was just some local legend to make the forest sound more mysterious. That only made me more determined to see it for myself. I set out early in the morning, loaded my camera gear, packed a thermos of coffee, and drove to Black Pines. It's a dense forest known for its thick canopy of pine trees and strange light anomalies. Some people have reported seeing flickering lights deep within the woods at night, like distant flashlights or lanterns. Others talk about a complete silence that sometimes settles over the forest, an unnatural stillness that makes every step feel like an intrusion. But at the time, those stories felt more like tales meant to give kids a thrill around the campfire. By the time I arrived at the forest entrance, the sky was overcast, perfect for capturing the soft, moody lighting I wanted. The dense fog rolled through the trees like ghostly fingers, curling around trunks and slipping over the ground. I set up my camera, took a few test shots, and then began to venture deeper, hoping for something really striking. As I walked, I noticed the silence. It started slowly, with the usual sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, chirping birds, and the occasional crack of a branch underfoot, fading away. It was subtle at first, like nature was holding its breath. Then it became absolute, an oppressive silence that swallowed even my own footsteps. I paused, standing in the stillness, telling myself it was just my imagination. I had wanted an eerie, atmospheric scene, and here it was. Still, I felt an unsettling prickling at the back of my neck, like something was watching me. I shook it off, took a few more shots, and pressed on. As I moved deeper, I saw something flicker between the trees, a shadowy movement, almost too quick to notice. I figured it was a deer or maybe a fellow hiker, but when I called out, no one answered. I glanced down at my camera, adjusted the settings, and raised it again to the spot where I'd seen the movement. I waited, my finger hovering over the shutter, watching the trees. That's when I saw it. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, stood between the pines. My heart skipped a beat. I can't fully describe it, but there was something wrong about the way it looked. It was almost human-shaped, but elongated, stretched, like it had been drawn by someone who didn't quite understand anatomy. Its limbs were long and bony, with joints that bent at odd angles. And its face, or rather, the hollow space where a face should have been, was like staring into a void. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just darkness. In a panic, I lifted my camera and snapped a photo. The flash lit up the fog for a brief second, and in that instant, the figure seemed to flinch, blending back into the shadows as if it were part of them. My heart pounded as I lowered the camera, but the figure was gone. I told myself I was seeing things. It had to be a trick of the light, some odd shadow from the trees. But as I started to back away, I heard a faint rustling, barely a sound, more like the whisper of wind through the branches, but somehow closer. I turned and started walking briskly back in the direction I came from, feeling the weight of that silence around me. The rustling followed, keeping pace with me, just out of sight. I broke into a run, branches scratching my arms as I stumbled through the underbrush. My camera bounced against my chest, and every few seconds I'd look back over my shoulder. And each time in the distance, I'd catch a glimpse of it. That same emaciated figure, gliding through the trees, watching me with those hollow, empty eyes. A small river cut through the forest, its waters shallow and icy. I splashed across, my breath coming in gasps. I thought for sure that the creature would follow, that it would glide right across the water. But when I reached the other side and looked back, the forest was still, nothing but the fog clinging to the trees. Shaken, I made my way back to the car, trying to convince myself it was all a product of my imagination. I hadn't seen anything. I'd just scared myself. The photos would prove it. There'd be nothing there but trees and fog. I kept telling myself that until I finally felt calm enough to drive home. But the photos, they told a different story. When I developed them the next day, most were just as I'd expected. Trees, fog, patches of light breaking through the canopy. But in several shots, especially the one where I'd used the flash, there was a shadowy figure lurking between the trees. Blurry, indistinct, but unmistakably there. A thin, elongated figure with arms that seemed to stretch unnaturally long, and a face that was just empty. Since then, I haven't been back to Black Pines. I haven't been able to shake the feeling that I'm still being watched, even now in my own home. Sometimes late at night, I'll hear the faintest whisper of a rustle outside my window, or catch a shadow moving just out of the corner of my eye. And each time, I remember that thing in the forest, waiting in the shadows. I'm not the only one who's seen it. Other hikers have reported strange sightings in Black Pines, enough that the rangers have put up signs warning against venturing too deep. They call it the Watcher, and I can't argue with the name. Whatever it is, it's out there. And if you go into Black Pines, it just might be waiting for you too. If that sent chills down your spine, just wait for the next one. It was supposed to be an ordinary morning. Just me, my fishing rod, and the quiet. I'm Caleb, and I've fished Stony Lake since I was young, sneaking out before dawn while the rest of the world slept. There's nothing quite like the chill of the morning air and the steady, calm fog rolling in over the water. That morning was no different, or so I thought. The fog was heavy, more so than usual, blanketing the lake in thick, swirling mist. It made the air colder, sharper. I was dressed in layers, but I could still feel it biting through to my bones. It was early, probably 4:30, and the lake was silent, which was just the way I liked it. I'd barely gotten my line cast out when I noticed something odd. Ripples. Small, subtle, but there was something strange about them. They weren't caused by a fish skimming the surface or a duck swimming by. These ripples were on the far side of the lake, moving in a deliberate line, closer, closer, toward me. I couldn't see anything causing them, just the shivering pattern on the water, cutting through the fog like it had somewhere it needed to be. I leaned forward, squinting, trying to see through the haze. The ripples stopped for a moment. Then, something dark passed just beneath the surface, a shadow, large and moving with purpose. Whatever it was big. Bigger than anything I'd ever seen in these waters. I sat there, half frozen, barely breathing, just watching. The fog thickened around me, making everything seem close, tight. I couldn't see the shore anymore. It was just me and the lake, alone, with whatever was out there. It moved again, gliding under the water. A flash of something that looked like a scale, a shadow that could have been a tail. I told myself it had to be a log, maybe a large fish. There were always rumors around Stony Lake, talk of strange things people had seen in the early morning fog. But this was different. This was right in front of me. I heard a low, scraping sound against the hull of my boat. My breath caught, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise. Whatever was out there was too close. The water went still for a moment, dead quiet, before the boat rocked. Then again, harder. I tightened my grip on the oars, every muscle tense. My mind raced with all the things that could be beneath me. But none of them could account for the weight, the sheer presence I could feel under the boat. Then, out of nowhere, it lunged. I didn't see it clearly, but there was no mistaking the size or the strength of it. A dark shape, hulking, with a massive head and rows of needle-like teeth. It struck the side of the boat with claws, actual claws that shredded through the wood like it was paper. The force nearly threw me overboard, but I managed to hold on, heart hammering in my chest. I didn't think. I just rode, pushing with everything I had, the boat barely holding together as I fought my way back to shore. The claws had gouged deep marks on the side, and I felt something warm on my arm. Blood. Mine. I didn't know when it happened, but somewhere in that attack, it had left its mark. When I finally hit the shore, I stumbled out, soaked, heart pounding like it would leap out of my chest. I could barely believe I'd made it back. The locals, they didn't believe me at first. Thought it was just an excuse for a fishing story, a tale to entertain. But when they saw the claw marks on the boat and the gash on my arm, they looked at me differently. They knew I wasn't one for tall tales. And word got around about that morning at Stony Lake. People started calling it the haunted pond. No one goes out there alone now, especially not in the early morning fog. As for me, I still fish, but not there. Not at Stony Lake. Some things are better left alone. Whatever I saw that morning, I never want to see it again. You thought that was unsettling? The next story will leave you speechless. I've been a park ranger for over 15 years now, and I've seen my fair share of strange things out in the wilderness. But nothing prepared me for what happened in that old fire lookout tower. And even now, all these years later, I'm still not sure what it was. Sometimes when the wind is high and the night falls heavy, I can still hear it in my head, clear as if I were back up there, listening. Let me start at the beginning. The lookout tower sat on a cliffside, about a mile hike up from the ranger station. Perched on the very edge, it seemed like it was always just a gust away from being blown clear off the rocks. The place was meant to spot wildfires, back when they'd used it more regularly. It had been in operation long before I came along, maybe even back to the 60s or 70s. I'd been stationed there a handful of times over the years for overnight shifts, monitoring the area, watching for any signs of trouble. It was lonely, yeah, but it had its perks. The view was incredible, and the radio only crackled to life every few hours with an update from base. This night, though, things felt different. You know that weird instinct people have, that prickling feeling in the back of your mind when something's off? That's what I felt, right from the start. I climbed the old wooden steps leading up to the lookout, listening to the boards creak under my boots. The wind was whipping around that night, shaking the tower so hard it felt like a boat swaying on rough water. I settled in, checked the radio, and scanned the surrounding forest with my binoculars, more out of habit than anything. The sky was mostly clear, with just a few clouds hiding the moon. Nothing out of the ordinary. Hours passed without incident. It was probably close to midnight when I first heard it, a soft scraping sound from just outside the tower. I froze, listening. I was alone up here. That much I knew. The other rangers were all accounted for, and no hikers were supposed to be in the area at this hour. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, but it didn't sound like the usual groans and rattles of the old structure. This was different, calculated, almost like someone, or something, was walking in a slow, careful circle around the base of the tower. I forced myself to get up and check the windows. I scanned the tree line, then peered down at the shadowy ground below. Nothing. After a few minutes, I managed to shake it off and went back to my post, convincing myself that the wind had just thrown me off. Then a soft thud sounded, right by the door. My skin prickled. and my heart pounded as I listened to it again, clearer this time. It was heavy, deliberate, like something was stepping closer. My fingers tightened on my flashlight, though I wasn't sure what I'd do with it. The thudding footsteps began moving around the tower again, slow and steady, echoing through the wooden floor. I stayed still, holding my breath, hoping it would just pass. But then came a sound that nearly made me jump out of my skin. A slow, dragging scratch along the floorboards, right outside the window. I shone my flashlight through the glass, trying to spot whatever was out there. For just a split second, I saw something, a hunched shape moving in the shadows. Tall, impossibly thin, with long arms that stretched far too long to be human. I flicked the light off and backed away from the window, my heart hammering. I didn't dare to look outside again. Whatever was out there was circling the tower now, dragging those awful claws along the wood as if testing it, like it knew I was inside. I backed up against the door, feeling the flimsy wood frame behind me. The pounding started soon after, each blow stronger than the last. The walls seemed to shake with each impact, and I could hear the boards creaking under the strain. I held my breath, hoping, praying it would stop. But it didn't. For what felt like hours, I stayed there, locked in my own fear, clutching my flashlight like it was some kind of weapon. The pounding would stop and start, never consistent, almost like it was trying to wear me down, waiting for me to make a move. I don't know when I finally drifted off, but the next thing I remember was the early light streaming through the windows, illuminating the empty room. It took me a few minutes to work up the courage to step outside. When I finally opened the door, the morning air felt like a shock to my system. I forced myself to look around, and that's when I saw the claw marks. Deep, jagged scratches gouged into the wood, tracing a rough, erratic line around the perimeter of the tower. My skin crawled as I stared at them, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I never stayed in that tower overnight again. To this day, no one knows what made those marks or what circled the lookout that night. They shut it down not long after, deeming it unstable and unsafe for overnight duty. But I know the truth. Whatever it wasn't just the wind or an animal. It was something else, something that wasn't meant to be seen. Now, every time I pass that place, I swear I can still hear it. The faint scratching of claws just outside my line of sight, waiting for the sun to set. If you think you can handle more, let's dive into what's next. I'm not the kind of person who scares easily. Years of studying wildlife taught me how to handle myself out in the woods, alone and in the dark. I could read the land, hear the subtle signals, and detect movement in ways that felt second nature. But something happened one night that I can't explain, and no matter how hard I try to put it behind me, it stays with me. It was late September, and I was out in a remote section of the park, tracking the movement of deer. We were in the middle of studying migration patterns, and I had to tag a few stragglers who hadn't made it through our study area yet. I was a little deeper in the woods than usual, in a section not often visited by hikers, with only the thick underbrush and twisted old trees around me. It was still, quiet, almost unnaturally so. That's what I noticed first, actually. Usually, there's some noise, even at night. Crickets, rustling leaves, maybe the distant sound of a river. But tonight, it was just silence. I brushed it off and focused on my task, scanning the underbrush and hoping for a glimpse of a doe or two. As I was moving through a patch of dense brush, I spotted movement in my peripheral vision, just a flash of something dark. It was a deer, or so I thought, moving in the underbrush to my left. But there was something odd about the way it moved, like its limbs didn't quite coordinate right, almost as if it were limping or struggling to walk. I adjusted my flashlight and tried to follow it with my eyes. The deer-like shape took another step, but again it seemed off. Its movements were jerky, almost mechanical. It was like it hadn't moved in a long time and was trying to remember how. I chalked it up to maybe an old injury or maybe even an illness. It's rare, but it happens. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow it, pushing through the thick brush as quietly as I could. The deeper I went, the stranger it became. The animal's outline was just visible between trees, but I could tell that its form was wrong. It was thin, way too thin, with legs that seemed too long and slender, and a set of antlers that twisted up like the gnarled roots of an ancient tree. I I stopped in my tracks, something in my gut telling me to turn around. But I kept looking. My flashlight caught its face just for a second, and that's when the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Its skin didn't look right, as if it were stretched over bones that were too sharp and too angular. The eyes were the worst part. They didn't look like deer eyes at all. They looked aware, intelligent, and something in that gaze felt deeply, disturbingly wrong. It wasn't curiosity in those eyes. It was hunger, and it was looking straight at me. I don't remember exactly how long I stood there, frozen in place, staring back at it. But suddenly, I heard a sound, a low, guttural noise, like a cross between a growl and a wheeze, echoing through the silence. My brain finally snapped to action, and I turned, practically tearing through the brush to get away. Branches snagged on my clothes and scratched my arms, but I kept running. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. My heart told me to keep going, to get as far away as possible. But some insane part of me kept thinking I'd hear footsteps behind me. Every few seconds, I'd dare a glance over my shoulder, but there was nothing. Somehow, I made it back to my car. I locked the doors, started the engine, and didn't look back as I sped down the old gravel road and out of the park. My hands were shaking, and every shadow along the road seemed to twist and shift in my headlights, as if that thing was just waiting to jump out in front of me. I never went back to that section of the park. I couldn't bring myself to. I even gave up on the research project entirely. Friends and colleagues asked why, but I never really gave them a straight answer. I couldn't because there was no answer that made sense. Months later, I met a park ranger who worked in the same area. We were chatting, and he brought up some strange stories he'd heard from hikers about seeing odd animals in the deeper parts of the park. When I asked him if he'd ever seen anything strange himself, he gave me a look. "Sometimes," he said, "when the wind's just right, I swear I still hear that sound, half cry, half growl. It's been years since that night, but sometimes, in the early morning hours when I can't sleep, I think about those twisted antlers and those predatory eyes. I still don't know what I saw, but I don't think I'll ever go looking for answers." That was just the beginning. Brace yourself for what's to come. I'm not usually one to believe in strange tales, but this is different. My name is Owen, and I've hiked some of the toughest trails in the Rockies, never once fearing what might be waiting in the shadows. But this story changed everything for me, and it's one I can barely tell without feeling a chill. It started like any other hike. I'd planned a solo trek up Lone Ridge, a place notorious for its unpredictable weather and brutal winds. It was late fall, and the air had a sharp bite to it, the kind that digs into your lungs when you breathe too hard. But the ridge had always drawn me in, with its wild, untouched beauty, and the kind of silence that only high-altitude places seem to have. I set up camp just as the sun began to dip, painting the ridgeline a deep orange. By dusk, I'd gathered enough firewood, pitched my small tent, and settled in for the night. The winds picked up as expected, and with them came that eerie, hollow sound that only a barren ridgeline can produce. I was used to it, spent enough nights out here to know what strange sounds were just nature's soundtrack. But as the evening dragged on, something changed. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound that didn't belong. It started low, a distant howl riding the gusts like a whisper carried on a breath. I'd heard wolves before, coyotes too, but this was neither. It was a haunting call, deeper and more drawn out. It seemed almost wrong, like someone trying to mimic a wolf's cry but failing. I brushed it off. Wolves, I told myself. I'd seen them prowling these mountains before, always keeping a safe distance. But the longer I lay there, the more the sound grated on me. It would stop for a while, leaving me in total silence, then suddenly return, each howl growing closer and closer. I tried to calm myself, staring at the ceiling of my tent and counting breaths, but that unsettling feeling had rooted itself in my gut. Then came the footsteps. At first I thought it was a trick of the wind, leaves rustling in the darkness. But the rhythm was unmistakable. Slow, heavy steps crunching over gravel, approaching my camp with deliberate slowness. I froze, holding my breath as the footsteps circled around me, each one resonating through the still night air. They weren't human steps, and they weren't like anything I'd heard from animals out here either. They sounded almost unnatural, each step slower and heavier than the last. Heart pounding, I grabbed a flare from my pack, clutching it tightly. My mind raced with explanations, anything that might make this make sense. But as I lay there, I could see something moving through the thin walls of my tent. A long, dark shadow, shifting and stretching across the fabric. Whatever it was tall, its form stretching to impossible lengths. I could feel it, whatever it was, standing there, watching. My mind screamed to stay silent, but my hand went to the flare, gripping it tighter. The thing outside started to move, circling the tent, that strange crunch of footsteps coming closer. I shut my eyes, waiting for it to pass, but it didn't. Instead, I heard a sound that still haunts me to this day, a low, throaty growl, followed by a deep, rumbling howl. It echoed across the ridge, a sound that sent shivers through my entire body. I couldn't take it any longer. With one swift motion, I yanked open the tent flap and struck the flare. The bright red light burst out, illuminating the ridge in a sudden blaze, and I finally saw it. Standing a few yards away, silhouetted against the rocks, was something I can only describe as a nightmare. It was tall, much taller than any man, with long, sinewy limbs and a muzzle that stretched unnaturally. Its mouth was filled with rows of serrated teeth, sharp and gleaming in the flare's glow. But the eyes were what struck me most, two pale orbs that reflected the firelight in a way that felt wrong. Those eyes didn't belong to any creature I'd ever seen. I stumbled back, almost losing my footing, but held the flare steady in front of me. The thing just stood there, watching me, its eyes unblinking and cold. I waved the flare, hoping to scare it off, and for a moment it didn't move. But then it let out a scream, a high, piercing shriek that shattered the night and echoed across the ridge. It was a sound I can't forget, a sound that seems to linger in my mind no matter how much time passes. Finally, it backed away, slipping into the darkness as silently as it had come. I didn't waste another second. I threw my gear together as fast as I could, not daring to look around as I packed up. I scrambled down the trail, not stopping until I reached the safety of my truck at the base of the ridge. The strangest part is, I wasn't the only one who heard it. A few weeks after I'd come down, I was talking to one of the park rangers about the experience, and he looked at me with an expression I'll never forget. He told me that every now and then they hear strange reports from hikers, sounds, shadows, things they can't explain. And sometimes late at night, he swears he hears that same scream, like it's still out there, prowling the ridge, waiting for the next unlucky soul to wander too close. Since that night, I've never gone back. Lone Ridge remains untouched by my footprints, and every time the wind howls through the mountains, I can't help but remember that night, wondering if it's out there still, watching and waiting. If that left you scared, the next story might leave you haunted. It was supposed to be a peaceful day, a chance to clear my head, to escape from the city noise and deadlines. I'd been to Willow Falls once before and remembered it as a beautiful, almost mystical place, a secluded waterfall surrounded by dense forest and mist that softened the rocky landscape like something out of a dream. As an artist, I was drawn to places like that. It's why I packed my brushes, easel, and a few canvases and drove out there early in the morning, hoping to capture the misty beauty on paper. The air was crisp as I hiked up the winding trail, and by the time I reached the waterfall, the sun was just beginning to filter through the treetops, casting an ethereal glow over everything. Perfect, I thought, setting up my supplies on a flat boulder just close enough to see the falls, but far enough to avoid the spray. I unpacked my things, soaking in the sounds of water crashing over rocks and the soft rustling of leaves. It was peaceful, just what I'd hoped for. Hours passed, though it hardly felt like it. I was lost in my work, caught up in each brushstroke, each detail. At some point, I noticed the light starting to change. Shadows lengthened, hinting that the day was already slipping away. As I glanced around, I was surprised by how quiet it had become. No birds chirping, no forest sounds, only the unending crash of the falls. The silence made me feel strange, but I brushed it off as nothing more than the oddness of being alone in nature. I went back to painting, but then I saw it. At first I thought it was just the play of light on the water or a trick of my eyes from staring too long at the rushing falls. But there was something moving in the depths, something dark that was definitely not the usual fish or leaves swept along by the current. I squinted, holding my breath as I tried to make out its shape. A shadow. Too large to be anything I could explain. I told myself it was a rock, a fallen branch, anything my mind could accept. But it shifted, rising from the water just enough for me to catch a glimpse. It was a figure. A chill ran down my spine as I froze, paintbrush still clutched in my hand. The figure was mostly submerged, but I could see enough to know it was watching me. Translucent skin glistened in the mist, almost blending with the water itself. The face, if it could be called that, was indistinct, almost featureless. What held my gaze were its eyes, dark, empty, yet somehow aware. And its hands, they were webbed, reaching toward the surface as if trying to pull itself further out of the water. My heart pounded so loud I was sure the thing could hear it. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, as it simply stared at me, unmoving, except for the subtle rise and fall in the water. Seconds stretched into eternity, and I felt like prey frozen in place, caught in the gaze of something that didn't belong in this world. Finally, it shifted, sinking back into the depths, leaving only ripples where it had been. As it disappeared, the forest seemed to come back to life. Birds chirped again, and a breeze rustled through the trees. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I grabbed my things, leaving my nearly finished painting and my brushes behind. My hands were shaking too much to gather everything, and a part of me was too afraid to go anywhere near the water's edge again. I practically stumbled down the trail, looking back over my shoulder every few steps, half expecting that shadow to emerge from the trees or appear along the path. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, heart racing, fingers fumbling with the keys. I didn't go back for my things. I didn't care. For weeks after, I tried to put it out of my mind, but every time I closed my eyes, I could still see those dark, empty eyes watching me, waiting. I stopped going to Willow Falls, avoided the area entirely. I even stopped painting for a while. Friends and family asked why I was acting strange, but I could never tell them the truth. How could I when I wasn't even sure what I'd seen? Then, one morning, I found a package on my doorstep. No note, no address. Inside was my painting, the one I'd left behind at the falls. My hands shook as I lifted it out, immediately noticing the long, jagged claw marks across the canvas, slicing through the misty landscape I'd so carefully painted. It was ruined, yet I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. The scratches looked almost purposeful, like something, or someone, had left them as a reminder. Or maybe a warning. I haven't been back to Willow Falls since. I don't know who or what sent me the painting, but every time I look at those marks, I feel that same unease creep over me, as if those dark, empty eyes are still watching, waiting for me to return, and I know I never will. Even now, years later, whenever I paint, I catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure lurking in the shadows, hidden just out of sight. And in the quiet moments when everything is still, I sometimes feel the faintest chill, as if I'm not alone. No one believes my story, of course. They say it was probably just my imagination, a bad dream that I turned into a memory. But I know what I saw, and I know I'll never forget it.